This is Caffeinated Risk, the monthly podcast for security professionals by security professionals, focused on the principles of enterprise security risk management, exploring technology and business management issues and how they relate to information security risk. Once a month, two self-proclaimed grumpy security guys bring you analysis, insights, and interviews with leading security risk professionals to learn how they work through a project, a program, or their careers using a risk-based approach to security. Now here are your hosts, Tim McCreet and Doug Leese.
Welcome, Doug Millward, to Caffeinated Risk. Thanks very much for agreeing to meet with us today. And,
no problem. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, full disclosure, I actually met Doug through school, so he is a legitimate school teacher. And we've got talking about risk, and, I'll let him do the explanation of how he got to where he is, but I thought this is an interesting angle. Most of the people that we interview on Caffeinated Risk are out in the professional world. Mm-hmm. And, Doug's from the academic side, but he didn't start there. No. So I'll let you start with how you got where you are.
It's kind of funny because my career started back. I'm a bit of an old guy, right? So my career started back.
Hey, watch the old guy.
Hey, we're all that's the whole purpose of this thing, right? So
I'm a seasoned veteran.
There we go. That sounds better. Yes. Yeah, seasoned veteran. That sounds better.
So my career kind of started back in the kind of mid '80s, and I started kind of the same industry as Doug, really. So I started in control systems. So I started there kind of straight from college and doing kind of computer systems for control systems, basically. And I guess that's where the kind of the focus on risk. But in those days, it was kind of more, not so much on security, but really on safety, yeah? Because you think about it, because the thing is, we were selling kind of effectively what you call a single board micro today, right? Mm-hmm. But they were controllers, right? And you could programmable in fourth, right? Yeah, that takes you back, right? And but the whole idea was, of course, is that these things would control your processes, your flows, and all that stuff. But of course, from a safety point of view, it would all be kind of relay logic and all that kind of stuff. So you'd have relays and that. And I think one of the interesting things for me was watching how that went from the early days of the guys going, yeah, we'll use your SCADA systems and your DCS and whatever to monitor what's going on. But when it comes down to the controlling safety, it's got to be relay logic, right? Because that's all we trust, because that's the only stuff that's fast enough, we know it won't fail or whatever. And then, 10 years on, towards the end of my kind of career in that kind of domain, it was all, they'd got kind of computerized PLCs with multi-processors and multiple inputs. And it's just interesting to see that move from something that was kind of guaranteed, which was your relay logic, through to, say, something like a ladder logic and a PLC, which was where you've got so you got dual redundant processors, dual redundant inputs, outputs, or whatever. Now, those PLCs must have cost 10 times what the relay logic would cost, but I guess you got the increased functionality, yeah? So I guess, right. So I'm not sure that going the PLC route was less risky, but it was certainly gave them more functionality. And I think that kind of reflects, I think, how it went in IT risk as well, I guess, really, basically. So, mm-hmm. So yeah, and then from there, obviously, I moved into kind of communications and network stuff, and then into software development, ultimately into kind of, architecture, solution architecture, and then designing systems kind of all the way through the system, basically. So, and then ultimately, I kind of split off at one point and went and taught in a real kind of university with bricks and mortar. And then now I'm kind of teaching in a kind of a virtual university where it's virtual bricks and mortar, basically. So.
Yeah. Well, it says on the brochure that it's real. I don't.
Yeah, there you go.
That's why I went. It said it was a real university.
It's real. Yeah.
Still looking for it, yeah, exactly.
The coursework's real. I know that part. I've got a lot of lost sleep to prove that.
There you go.
And it was in your class that we were talking about risk management. And yes. The tutor session went on everything from Black Sabbath to snow in Fort McMurray and occasionally talked about risk, is that you'd be the perfect caffeinated risk guest, because that's what we do.
About Rush as well. We've talked about Neil Peart and all that. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
So I kind of think I think we talked about the kind of science of risk and the science of security.
That's what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
That's what fascinated me. What is the science of risk? You don't officially need a badge that says I am a scientist to do science.
No.
But you do have to follow the scientific method to say that it's scientific.
Absolutely, yes.
So walk us through how you would do a hypothesis on risk.
Okay, so I think kind of to step back a bit, I think where the idea kind of comes from is that if you talk about computer science for a start, right? So when computer science kind of came out, say the 40s, right? It wasn't recognized as a science, right? It was kind of, people would say, oh, it's a bit of maths. Some people would say it's a bit of electronics. And it really only became a science when a whole bunch of people, so like, your kind of Alonzo Churches, your Alan Turings, your Maurice Wilkses, your von Neumanns, all of these guys, over a period of maybe 20, 30 years, right? They kind of came up with theories and models and whatever. And eventually today, hopefully, right, people acknowledge that like computer science is a science in its own right, as opposed to a derivative of something else, right? And I think that's where we are kind of with cybersecurity, right? And I think cybersecurity has got even more difficulties in the fact that, as we've said, you've got the risk components in there, and then you've got the computer science components, and then you've got all of your kind of human components as well. So there's a huge amount of cybersecurity that's about the risk about people. Like your weakest link is the old picnic analogy. Your problem's in the chair, not in the computer. So that we are that kind of problem. Right? We are the person, that soft bit of meat in between the computerized systems. Right? So we need the kind of discipline that those pioneers made for computer science. We need that same kind of stuff really for cybersecurity and for cybersecurity risk, right? So I guess there's a few names out there. I mean, there's a guy called August Kirchhoffs, which I don't know if you heard of.
Yep.
The guy who kind of invented cryptography back in 18th century, something like that, basically, right? So he kind of kicked us all off there. And then there was Claude Shannon, right? So, I mean, we all know Shannon, right? Yep. Shannon was your communications guy. He was, the guy was a genius, and he did a lot of stuff. And then kind of more recently, you've got your Revest and your Shamirs and your Eidelmans, your RSAs for your encryption stuff. And then, of course, a couple of my favorites are Salzer and Schroeder, which were so these guys kind of wrote probably the first book on kind of, I guess, computer security. And they said the protection of information into computer systems. And they basically kind of came up with a bunch of rules that said, if you follow these rules, then you'll have a secure system. And those rules have been kind of modified and built on, and people have taken bits out. But basically, so that was in the 70s, by the way. So that was 76, right? So between then and now, people have taken those rules and modified them or whatever. But effectively, they are kind of your core rules that people have used for certainly the computerized part of kind of cybersecurity. And then there were other guys. So Chris Strachey, who was heavily involved in the computer science part. He also, a lot of his stuff kind of works with cybersecurity. And then you've got people like Mitnick, right? So, of course, Mitnick being, of course, he's more on your human side. So he's more about the kind of social engineering as opposed to kind of, computer engineering.
Well, interesting you bring him up. I've met the guy a few times personally.
Okay.
And scientist wouldn't be the first word that comes to mind for me.
No.
But as you're explaining that, as I'm thinking about it, he researched, he understood, he knew how.
Yes.
And how he acquired some of his information by digging through, manuals, sometimes manuals that were disposed of unplanned, etc. Yeah, I've never really considered him a scientist, but he tried to do it, at least based on his books, because he was curious about what's there rather than I want to make $1 million.
Yeah. And I think that's so I think, like you say, the when you boil down the scientific method into its most basic kind of principles, right? You've got two things, haven't you? You've got the hypothesis, and then you've got your research, right? So you come up with a hypothesis, right? Like this cup is orange, right? And then you go out and say, okay, how do I prove that kind of cup is orange? And then you go and so you go and do research, or you do experiments or whatever to kind of do that. And in many ways, that's what, I mean, Mitnick probably, like you say, Mitnick, I agree with you, right? He doesn't come across as a scientist, right? But the fact is that unconsciously, I guess that's what he did, right? So he would have this idea that said, I've got a hypothesis, which is, his hypothesis might be, I could break into these guys' systems and steal some secrets, right? And then his research would be, okay, let's find out how I could actually do this, basically, yeah? So that's kind of where it came from.
So Doug, can I ask, I mean, so with so many, you've got the practitioners in the field, and I don't think science is the first thing that a consultant or a practitioner is looking at when they're gearing up for a risk assessment.
I agree.
But how do you get that group of people, like the majority of the folks that that the other Doug and I have worked with in our careers are the consultants that go into the business, or the analysts that are assessing the risks? How do you get them to think, or at least adopt some of those principles, so that we can move this further along, that we can get that more professional approach, or look at things from including that academic lens? Because I don't know that the average guy is going to sit back and go, I have to structure my hypothesis and then I'm going to prove it against the client, right?
Exactly. So, but I think what comes here is there's another guy that me and Doug are familiar with, which is a guy called Doug Hubbard, right? So Douglas Hubbard wrote a couple, and again,
all them Dougs, they're just smart guys. You got to listen to them. Like, that's just it. Yeah.
A lot of Hubbard's theories are kind of Marmite, right? You love them or you hate them, right? But what he did say is, he made some things that make a lot of sense, right? And one of the things he said that the risk, and he wasn't talking really specifically about IT risk, but he was talking about the field of risk as a whole, right? And he was saying that kind of risk since maybe the 40s has been defined by four people, right? And he said, well, four groups really, right? And he said the first was what he calls the war quants, right? So these were engineering types, and these were the guys who kind of came up with your kind of missile tables and your height of your guns to make sure you could hit the Germans or whatever, right? So they were the first guys, right? And then you have your actuaries, which, you've actuarial science, right? So, these are the guys who kind of analyze risk and give you a number about it, right? And then you've got economists, and you've got all of these things like, you've got kind of portfolio theories and all that kind of stuff, right? And then the last kind of people who he kind of poo-poos really were your management consultants, right? And the problem is that maybe a lot of the guys we might meet in risk consultancy might kind of come from I'm not saying everybody, but obviously we've got Mr. Doug there, who obviously comes from a very scientific background, but some of the guys might come from kind of management consultancy. And what Hubbard said, and I'm not saying this is true, just for the record, being on a recording, but what Hubbard said was that the management consultants basically take qualitative risk assessments and try and pass them off as quantitative assessments, right? Now, the difference between the two is a quantitative assessment is based on, again, what we're talking about is based on research, right? So there's a hypothesis beneath it, you've got data beneath it, and then you've got statistical inference and background, which gives you a bit of weight to say, right, well, I'm using this as a measure of risk. I know it's based on historical measurements, right? The problem with qualitative, it's not based on those kind of numbers. It's based on somebody's gut feel. So you've got all of those issues with kind of unconscious bias and all of those issues with kind of, knowledge and intrinsic knowledge, all those kind of things that we've got in the human brain kind of washing around in there, wash into our qualitative kind of risk assessment. Now, that's okay as long as we tell everybody this is a qualitative assessment. That's fine. But once you start trying to pass off a qualitative assessment as a quantitative assessment, that's where the kind of trouble starts, right? And I think the problem is some, not all, but some of the risk frameworks you'll see are based on qualitative assessments that get passed off as quantitative assessments.
I'm thinking about that and this is just right out of the air. It's like, okay, so what do you guys think about this? The qualitative assessment, I hire a professional. And, if Tim McCreate, who's been studying this for decades, I'm not allowed to say how many, apparently.
Well, not anymore, yeah.
Not anymore. It's a big number, though, just saying. Yeah. When somebody with that level of experience says, here's what I'm thinking, there's a reason that you hired somebody of his caliber.
Yes.
That makes perfect sense. Maybe the kicker on the end of that is, but here you have to understand that this is just my professional opinion. And what I really recommend for you is the following study,
yes,
which I am happy to facilitate for you because, of course, I'm a management consultant. But that said, you probably could do an excellent job of facilitating it because you know the outcomes. And I read a quote a long time ago now on the SANS advisory board, all the propeller heads, they weigh in on everything under the sun. I think I've posted twice. So I just lurked, right? But there was a quote there that's always stuck with me. You have one person's opinion, you have an opinion. If you have 100 people's opinions, you have data.
Yeah.
How do we move the people with the checkbooks, the executives, to say, thank you for your qualitative opinion, and now that I understand the difference, I am willing to fund a quantitative approach?
There was a guy you had on the podcast a couple of months ago, maybe, Terry.
Yep. Terry.
So and Terry had his TAC trees, right? And the TAC trees were great because I think the thing is that they do two things. One is they get you to do, I guess, initially you might do a kind of a pseudo kind of qualitative assessment. So you'll look at maybe the types of risk, which you could kind of argue is a little bit kind of qualitative. But the great thing about those trees is that in the same model, you can then switch over and you can go, okay, now we can do a quantitatively analysis. Okay, so now what we can do is say, right, we've got these risks. How do we kind of evaluate these risks with some kind of number that makes a sense to people? So, whether that's kind of, this is what it's going to cost your business when this guy hacks in, or whether it's going to be, this is how much money you're going to lose, or whether it's going to be, this is the amount of downtime you're going to get if this system goes down. But the thing is, what you do is so it's exactly what you say, really, Doug, is the fact that, you start off with that kind of qualitative assessment, and then once you've done that, then you back it up with the quantitative. But the great thing about those attack trees tool is that you don't have to go to another tool. And I think that's a great thing. If you tell somebody you've got to throw away all that work and buy another tool and start again, then they start sitting and going, all that money we spent on that initial analysis.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. But if you can repurpose that analysis and then make it quantitative and add value to it at that point, I think maybe that's how you kind of buy people in and get people. And I think that's maybe why Terry's tool is a really good tool, because it kind of does both things, I guess.
And actually, I like that, Doug, because it's just, so I'm going to pick on myself after doing this for so many years. I'm not going to say how many anymore, but after doing this for so many years, because you start off I started off as that, in that management consulting role, and then becoming that executive where it's that reactive component, right? You see something and you get this visual reaction inside. It's like, oh my God, this is bad. We have to stop this. But how bad?
Yes.
And what's the impact of bad? And can you give me a number so that I can compare it and bring it to the board? So what really helped me, at least what I did when I started to get more mature in the process was, look, I need to now step back and I have to back this up with data. And to your point earlier, is that the idea now is it can't just be that qualitative, my reaction, my gut feel that this is really bad, we need to fix this. Or, my favorite, and this is many years ago, I heard this from somebody, all users are stupid. It's our job to make them smart. No, it's not our job at all. It's our job is to figure out what's the risk that they're facing, but be objective in that perspective. And that's where, we talk a lot on the podcast about about the enterprise security risk management modules, or the methodology, or the framework, or philosophy. And to me, to simplify it even more, is I need to find that data, but I need to, as a professional, figure out how to do that and be objective. because you can do a number of different studies, and I'm not saying this personally, but you can get a lot of data that really reflects your position and not the other side. So it's how do you find that objective perspective? I guess that's the question for me is, how do you train the management consultants who are doing time in the field that you need to be objective in that viewpoint, that you need to look at the data points from both sides of what that particular risk is? Like, how do you get that mindset across to people that this is part of the scientific method? It's a true objective viewpoint of what the risk really is.
Well, and I think this is, again, comes back to something I kind of try and teach when I'm teaching, which is the fact that I always say to the students, and I know Doug put me up in this, but we'll come on the slack, but I always say to the students, challenge everything, right? I think, and I don't really think students understand why some lecturers kind of say go for journal papers or refereed journals rather than a kind of a blog or something, right? Now, me and Doug were discussing this, right? As he said, there are some good blogs out there. However, I think that the point of the thing you need to understand, I think challenge everything is the argument, right? And I think that the point you need to understand is that a refereed paper, you hope, and of course we know it's not always true, right? But a refereed paper, you hope, there's been through other people in the field who understand that kind of technical area, and at that point they will try and pick you up on kind of assumptions you've made, or the fact that maybe you haven't gone into any kind of detail. The problem with a blog is that level of kind of review is not always there. Now, sometimes there were people with blogs who write really good blogs, and they check the data and they make sure and they show you data, and they will make sure that all of their facts have been checked and assured before they publish. There are other people who write blogs and it's just opinion, but they don't tell you it's opinion, but they try and pass it off as fact. And there's other people who will write blogs, and I won't mention any names or companies, but there's other people who write blogs because they will be trying to sell you something or get you to go down a certain route or try and get you to buy into their way of thinking. And you need to be critical enough to understand that that's what's happening to you. So it's a challenge everything. I think that's the thing. So I think kind of coming back to you, I was a very long-winded answer. I'm sorry, but I think,
we had a long question before, so yeah.
No, but I think that's the thing. I think the thing is what you got to do is get people to challenge. So I think there's that great temptation to again take an opinion and then try and turn the opinion into a fact or whatever, rather than trying to say, okay, I've got an opinion, can I now back it up with some evidence? So it's that difference between trying to sell your opinion as opposed to trying to prove your opinion.
Yeah, definitely. The official word for that, I think, is pseudoscience, where you are doing something, and absolutely vendor papers are, I don't want to say the worst, but they are the most likely to have that in there.
It's the bias, right? And that's the one that kills me, is that you can, as soon as you start reading, like, wait a minute, I don't need to buy product ABC. I already have that, right? But their argument is structured in such a way that their bias shows from the time you start reading it to the end. It's like, oh, mother of God, I got to buy this because I have all these risks, and I haven't even thought of that problem, right?
But they don't say to you, there are various ways of solving this, and our product is one, which would be fair. They actually go, this is the problem, and hey, good news, we've solved it for you. They don't mention that so have half a dozen other people, or that you could take a basic firewall and tune it, or add one more parameter, and hey, it's solved. Tick the box for it.
Yeah.
This is something you're researching right now and digging into more, correct?
Exactly. So the stuff I'm kind of working on research-wise is kind of so I think we when we started, we talked about the science of security and the science of risk, right? So, and I think I mentioned to you, Doug, a while ago that this whole idea came from the NSA launched something probably about 5-6 years ago, and they basically said we need a science of security. And to actually kind of, and this answers your question as well, I guess, Tim, really. only an hour later than you asked it, but never mind.
That's okay, though. This is good, right?
So basically, they kind of came up with what they call the NSA hard problems. So they kind of formulated some hard problems, right? And these problems were scalability and composability. So how do we manage the risk around those? Policy-driven secure collaboration, right? So in other words, how do we collaborate securely and have that by some kind of policy, right? Security metrics-driven SDLC, which is kind of what we've been talking about already, right? Resilient architectures, which I know kind of Doug looked at a while ago, right? And understanding and accounting for human behavior, which I guess is what we just talked about with requirements, right? So they are their kind of 5 or 6, depending on how you split them up, hard problems, right? And the reality is that I think, risk is probably, paramount in all of those kind of hard problems, really. They're all kind of in there. So the little bit that I've been looking at is kind of the composability bit. So this is the idea that, and this is kind of where the risk comes in, right? So systems are more composable now. So Doug and you, Tim, will understand. So maybe 10 years ago, I'll be generous here, right? 10 years ago, right, what would happen is if I was going to design a new IT system, you'd get an enterprise architect who'd come in with the overall idea, right? Then he'd get some infrastructure architects and some kind of network architects and software engineers. And basically what would happen is each of these guys would create a document. It was a very document-centric process. And ultimately, you would hand that over to some engineers, and they would go away and build this thing for you, right? And everything was hunky-dory, right? Now, the problem with the cloud is that the cloud, whether you go AWS or Google or whatever, the cloud gives you blocks of functionality, right? So the idea is that that you can actually take these blocks and build a system much easier without these, getting all these other kind of little people involved. You can just go and do it yourself. But the problem is involving all of those people de-risked the whole process, right? Because you had multiple pairs of eyes, you had multiple domains and different people looking at each of these designs to actually say, right, even if it's not my domain, I might kind of pick up an error, or might pick up an error moving from one domain to another domain, right? The problem is that when you actually make these things composable, i.e. you can just pick blocks off a shelf and kind of put them together, right? Then the problem is you kind of get rid of some of that de-risking process. And the problem is now is that there are graphical tools. So there's UML builders, there's SysML builders, and there's a thing called Cloud Camp, which will build cloud systems for you. And these are GUIs, so you can literally fire this thing up, click a few blocks, hit this, it'll turn it into an AWS configuration for you, and it'll run. But the problem with it is, who's checked that, right? Who's checked the security of it? Who's checked that, that all of those kind of gateways that you would have had before that you had to go through to make sure this was ready to be used, they've all gone. They've all been removed. You've probably got one software engineer who's literally just graduated, who's literally kind of building the system, right? And there was a paper, some research done by Palo Alto, right? Published by a guy called Matthew Chodie. So I don't know if he works for them or he works for another organization, right? Basically, they did an analysis and they found nearly 200,000 IAC templates, right, that were insecure, that had got things like, hadn't got certificates in there, or had got kind of root passwords, or kind of fired, embedded into the certificate, into the actual template, or stuff like them, no security at all, or, just loads and loads of errors. And they got like 200,000 of these things, these templates that had got and the problem is those things are being used by people, right? And those things are being used to build cloud systems. So what I've been looking at is this kind of research around composable systems. So the fact is that we know people are going to do this. Right? We know people are going to go out there and use whatever tools they've got and build, because that's what AWS and Google and Microsoft are selling you. They're saying, hey, you don't need to spend all this money on engineers and designers and architects. You can just go out there and, pay us $50 a month and hey, you can build your own system. Well, yes, you can, but, will the system work? Will it be secure? Is it when you're going to lose all your resources to some kind of script kiddie kind of hacking the internet? And this is the problem, right? So I've been kind of looking at, so what I'm interested in is one, how can we make those composable systems more secure, right? So in other words, you've got to find some way of kind of making them more secure by default, right? So maybe give somebody a tool, which is, they can put the composability in there, but then when they put the system together, maybe they click a button and it'll check on them and give them this kind of, 25-page list of all the things they haven't done and they should do before they kind of publish it onto the internet, right? There are obviously ways of checking these things at the moment, but the problem is, it involves kind of modeling or whatever, and these people won't, if they can't afford to get themselves some professionals to build a system, they sure as heck can't afford to go and get somebody to model a system for them, right? So they're going to put these things together, put them out on the internet, and then, how long before some script kiddie comes along and goes, oh, look, I managed to hack into your system and steal all your data or, bring down your shopping cart or whatever, basically. So,
right.
So I say that the problem is that as things become easier to build, we need some kind of, security in there to de-risk this process that replaces the manual process that used to exist maybe 10 years ago, basically.
And this is why I love the podcast, right? Because now I got homework. I got stuff I'm going to be able to do when I get back to work. And I'm waiting for your research now because this is stuff that we're all looking at right now. So I know this has been awesome, right? This has just been awesome.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, thank you again for joining us. I know it's we're across the pond and we're doing this early in the morning, so we now need to go to work.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, guys,
but this has been I got a lot of notes out of this.
It's been great speaking to you. Thanks for the opportunity, and obviously I think hopefully that the podcast will go from strength to strength, and more people will listen to this, and I think it's a way of like you say, it's another way of kind of disseminating useful information from all sorts. I mean, I say I've got an awful lot out of the ones you've done already, so hopefully it goes from strength to strength, guys. Thanks very much for this.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, you.
That's awesome. Thanks so much for everything. Thanks for listening to the latest podcast from Caffeinated Risk. Make sure you visit our website, caffeinatedrisk.com, to stay up to date on what we've been working on. Our website has bios of our podcast guests, posts about topics we're passionate about, and even a library of reference material we find valuable in the work we do every day. And don't forget to subscribe to Caffeinated Risk on your favorite podcast service. This way, you'll be notified when we release our next podcast, and you can listen to our previous guests just in case you missed them. Thanks so much for listening to Caffeinated Risk.